Ladies and gentlemen, the PC landscape is somewhat in turmoil at the moment thanks to multiple CPU and GPU launches from Intel, AMD, and of course Nvidia. With companies keen to cash in on the mining craze, plus on the Intel side of things, X299 has launched. AMD are very close to releasing Threadripper, which will be setting its sights to compete directly with X299 in the high-end desktop market, and Vega Gaming Editions, in other words the RX cards, having the finishing touches put on them by Team Red as we speak. But while things are confusing in the PC market, they're not that much better on the console side of things. For example, the PlayStation 4 Pro was released in November of last year, and currently we're waiting for the Xbox One X, which is Microsoft's answer to the re-released 4K focused consoles. There's currently a lot of discussion of how powerful the Xbox One X is. In fact, there was a recent interview with the official Xbox magazine, OXM, and this is from Sumo Digital's design director, Gareth Wilson. He said that the system eats 15,000 props for breakfast, and it will actually, well, be considerably more powerful than the PS4 Pro. He says, and I quote, "I don't mind saying that it is significantly more powerful than the PlayStation 4 Pro, and we worked on the PS4 Pro. It's way more powerful. It's a night and day difference." Now bear in mind, Sumo Digital are currently working on Crackdown 3. So one could definitely possibly take some bias into account. But an interesting series of internal benchmarks has popped up on Eurogamer. What essentially happened is that Microsoft wanted to show off to developers how powerful the Xbox One X is versus the original Xbox One. So what it did is it used the original Xbox One as a baseline and then of course compared it to the Xbox One X. Somewhat interestingly, the titles themselves were not mentioned by name, so you have to do a little bit of due diligence or just use a little bit of lateral thinking to ascertain which title is which. For example, Title B is a sports/racing game with a target of 1080p 60 FPS and running DirectX 12, with the status being in development of March 2017. So obviously there's not many titles which fit that description, i.e. only really one, at least as far as we are aware, and that would be Forza Motorsport 7. You could also probably deduce Title C pretty easily as well, since it's listed as a linear shooter using Unreal Engine 4 with a target of 1080p 30 FPS on the original Xbox, and of course with the API of DirectX 12. Once again, Gears of War 4 is the only title which really would fit that criteria, at least as far as we're aware, especially given it says shipped. Now what I find most intriguing about these results is they are not the results of the port and then hefty optimization. Instead, these are minuscule amounts of optimization. Essentially, all developers are really doing is using a very basic optimization process of simply mapping ESRAM memory addresses to standard GDDR5. There is no tweaking. So what does that mean in reality? Well, Eurogamer does point out that this means there's going to be a lot of unnecessary read-write addresses, because obviously with the original Xbox One having ESRAM with the DDR3 memory as a main memory pool, that's 8GB and 32MB respectively of DDR3 and ESRAM, what would have to happen is that if data needed to be copied from, let's say, DDR3 to ESRAM, well, that would have to be a read-write request. Obviously, it would read from one, write to the other one, and then, reverse. So, in essence, if you have all of that data, ESRAM and now DDR3, mapped to the same memory pool, GDDR5, what you're basically doing is almost segmenting the memory. Think of it almost like having two separate memory pools and almost artificially saying, okay, this memory is being delimited, it's being basically said this is ESRAM, even though it's really not. It is essentially the same memory pool, but to the software it doesn't think so. So let's say memory pool A is GDDR5, memory pool B is GDDR5, which is now being, at least to the software, acting like ESRAM. So essentially it's just reading and writing to itself. There are a couple of caveats here. The first caveat is that This is irrespective of real-world game frame rates. So what has to... Obviously, if a game is locked to 60 FPS, as is the case of, say, Forza, they are not testing that. They're testing what it could actually run at, in which case they have around 90 frames per second, assuming there was no other visual improvements made. So in other words, all they were doing was ramping up the resolution, zero else. The second caveat is that this is just a slice. It was a slice of time in the GPU. In other words, it's a snapshot rather than, let's say, an average of, let's say, 5 minutes of gameplay. Now, this is imperative to remember because obviously load, CPU, GPU, memory, and so on changes frame by frame. That's why if you've ever run a game with, say, Fraps or MSI Afterburners, you can see the frame rate counter. And if you're a PC gamer and you've never done that, well, you should, just to get an insight into what I'm saying. And you're running through a game. Obviously, if you're running through a really old game, then you're probably going to hit, like, 100 frames a second pretty much all the time. But if it's a newer game and you're pushing the resolution, you're going to notice it might go from like 57 frames a second to like 63 frames a second, then maybe up to 70 frames a second, then back to 51 maybe. And this also can be almost on the same scene, if you will. You can just simply look at the floor, and obviously if you're looking at the floor, there's a very good chance that, well, the floor's not too far away, is it? Therefore, it doesn't have to render so much. Whereas, if you're looking in the distance, let's say, of a large hillside vista, and perhaps there's some animals running around in the distance, and you've got, let's say, some foliage blowing in the wind, and blah, blah, blah. Obviously, that's a lot more for the CPU, GPU, and everything else in the world to handle. Perhaps the other fascinating thing for me is the way that Microsoft and the Xbox One X... I really prefer the name Scorpio. I know I've said that multiple times, but it bears repeating until the cows come home. But it's fascinating how Microsoft have handled this. So, if you've been following along with the Scorpio news for some time, you'll be aware that Microsoft have pretty much given the promise that original Xbox One title. So let's say you released a game or you bought a game on the Xbox One way back when, and the developer says, yeah, we're not so much with the keen on actually, releasing a patch to improve this to make it run at 4K or with better textures or what have you. So what Microsoft have done here is instead, well, it's using a different setup. Essentially, the GPU is being cut in half. So you have half the number of ROPs, half the number of compute units. So it's being cut down to just 20 rather than 40. And, of course, this is a theory because obviously A, I'm not having access to the development hardware so that I can't test it, and B, I don't even have a Scorpio machine sitting in my home. Microsoft, if you're listening, feel free to offer me one. So basically, in theory, this means that you're going to get good performance boosts. It possibly will run with super sampling, perhaps better anisotropic filtering or whatever, but the frame rate is also going to be more stable. You're going to get faster loading times. However, in theory at least, you're also not going to break the game. So the title's not going to be that, what's going on? Where's my medicine? I'm not really sure what to do anymore. And then obviously you're going to get issues with frame rates being kind of all over the shop or whatever. I think the reason that Microsoft have gone this route, to be honest, is very simple. They are trying, and reality are not two distinctly different things, but they're trying to make it so that developers are going to be keen to really emphasize or utilize the power of the Xbox One X. So, for example, because it's very easy to port PC games over, and perhaps because it's very easy to get Xbox One titles to run at higher resolution or higher frame rate, or perhaps with just better graphical assets, they believe that at the very least they can get games which are cross-platform. So, for example, they're released on the PC as well, or perhaps on the PS4, the PC, and the Xbox One. So, in theory, the Scorpio version, if you will, can run best. It can look at most aesthetically pleasing, or at least as close as to a high-end PC as what's possible for a console. Obviously, at the end of the day, this system is still a console. And yes, if you own a really high-end GPU, if you own a very high-end CPU, then if you've got like two GTX 1080s and you're running on like a 4K screen, then obviously you're probably going to get a better gaming experience. But Microsoft are not targeting necessarily you. They're targeting someone who's perhaps already invested in the Xbox One ecosystem. They're targeting individuals who perhaps have an original PlayStation 4, and perhaps I'm thinking, well, if I buy an Xbox One X, then I get better cross-platform games, but I also get the Xbox One exclusives, but I also get the PlayStation 4 exclusives, so that's a nice boon for me. So perhaps that's, Microsoft's intent. Obviously, I'm not working in their marketing department, so I can only make some assumptions. Finally, I'd also like to say that I personally am going to be very curious to see how all of this plays out over the next several months. Microsoft are going to have definitely the best hardware in terms of the console, arena, but having the best hardware does not necessarily equate to developers really optimizing for that hardware. So ultimately, it really comes down to what developers are willing to do, what developers will basically be willing to push forward for your platform as opposed to others. It's very possible, though, that they could just make the Xbox One X the lead platform, dial things down for the PlayStation 4 Pro, or even if the PS4 Pro is the lead platform, it wouldn't take too much for them to have just slightly more stable frame rates, perhaps slightly higher resolution, perhaps slightly better draw distance or whatever for the Xbox One X. So it's quite an interesting scenario we've got on our hands. With all of that said, hopefully you have enjoyed the video. Normal stuff, like, share, subscribe. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.